The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Mike Cross hadn't been a cop for 3 years, but the sound of that ringtone still sent adrenaline through his veins like it was yesterday. He stared at the screen. Sheriff Tom Bradley. They hadn't spoken in over a year, not since Mike walked away from the badge and everything it represented. Shadow lifted his head from the floor beside the bed, ears forward, amber eyes reflecting the phone's glow. The German shepherd knew that ringtone too. Mike answered. Tom's voice was strained, barely controlled panic breaking through years of professional training. Something was very wrong. He needed Mike's help. Not official help. Personal help. The kind that doesn't get reported. The kind that might be the difference between life and death. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Tom Bradley was pinned down in the Cascade Mountains, 30 miles from the nearest road. He'd gone up there following a lead on a cold case, alone, against every protocol in the book. Now someone was hunting him. He was wounded, running out of ammunition, and his radio was dead. He'd managed one satellite call to Mike before the signal cut out. Mike could have called it in. He could have woken up the entire sheriff's department and sent a tactical team into those mountains. That would have been the smart move, the safe move, the move that wouldn't cost him everything if it went wrong. But Tom Bradley had been his partner for 7 years. The man had pulled Mike out of a burning meth lab, had stood beside him at his wife's funeral, had been the only one who understood why Mike needed to walk away from the job. You don't abandon a man like that, badge or no badge. Mike looked down at Shadow. The dog was already on his feet, watching him with that intense focus that had made him legendary in the K9 unit. Shadow had saved more lives than Mike could count, had taken bullets meant for other officers, had tracked suspects through conditions that would break trained human trackers. He was 10 years old now, retired from the force just like Mike, but the fire in those amber eyes hadn't dimmed one bit. Mike made his decision in less than 5 seconds. They were in Mike's truck within 10 minutes, heading east toward the mountains as the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the horizon. Mike had grabbed his go-bag, the one he'd kept packed out of habit even after retirement. Inside was everything he might need for a backcountry extraction: tactical first aid kit, climbing rope, emergency beacon, water purification tablets, high-calorie rations, thermal blankets, and his Glock 19 with 4 spare magazines. He'd also grabbed his old tactical vest, the one with Shadow's name still velcroed to the K9 handler patch. The drive took 90 minutes, pushing the truck hard on mountain roads that were barely maintained. Mike's mind was running through scenarios, trying to piece together what Tom had gotten himself into. The cold case Tom mentioned was probably the Mackenzie murders, a family of 4 found dead in their remote cabin 8 years ago. The official story was murder-suicide, the father snapping under financial pressure. Tom had never believed it. He'd worked that case until the department told him to let it go. If Tom had found something, found someone, it meant the real killer had been walking free for 8 years. And now that killer knew Tom was coming. The sun was fully up by the time Mike reached the trailhead Tom had mentioned in his brief call. There were 2 vehicles parked there, Tom's official sheriff's SUV and a dark blue pickup truck with mud covering the license plates. Mike felt his gut tighten. The pickup didn't belong. He parked 50 yards back, keeping his truck out of sight behind a stand of pine trees. Shadow was already at the door, a low whine in his throat. The dog could sense the danger, could smell the wrongness in the air. Mike checked his weapon, chambered a round, and clipped Shadow's tactical harness onto the dog's broad chest. The harness was old but well maintained, black nylon with reinforced stitching and attachment points for a lead. Shadow stood perfectly still as Mike worked, his whole body vibrating with controlled energy. This was what he'd been trained for. This was what he lived for. Mike knelt down and looked into Shadow's eyes, placing both hands on either side of the dog's face. For a moment, Handler and K9 were connected in the way only years of partnership can create. Shadow understood. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't training. This was real, and someone Mike cared about was in trouble. They moved into the forest at a tactical pace, Mike keeping low, Shadow ranging ahead, but never more than 20 feet away. The trail was steep and rocky, climbing rapidly into dense timber. Mike could see bootprints in the soft earth, 2 distinct sets. One was Tom's service boots, a pattern Mike would recognize anywhere. The other was larger, deeper impressions, suggesting a heavier man or someone carrying substantial gear. The second set of prints was following Tom's trail, hunting him. 3 miles in, Mike found the first blood. It was on a boulder beside the trail, a smear of red already turning brown in the morning air. Not a lot of blood, but enough to confirm Tom was injured. Shadow sniffed at it, his whole body going rigid. The dog looked back at Mike, waiting for the command. Mike gave a hand signal, one they'd practiced thousands of times. Track. Find. Shadow's nose went to the ground, and he pulled forward with purpose, following a scent trail invisible to human senses. They were moving faster now, leaving the main trail and pushing into rougher terrain. Mike's legs burned from the climb, his lungs working hard in the thin mountain air. He was 48, not 25 anymore, but adrenaline and determination pushed him forward. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Just the sound of Mike's breathing and Shadow's paws on stone and pine needles. Then Mike heard it, echoing down from somewhere above them. A gunshot. Then another. Then a full magazine dump, the rapid fire of someone either very desperate or very angry. Shadow froze, ears forward, every muscle in his body tense. Mike counted the seconds of silence that followed. His radio crackled to life. Not his police radio, his personal one, the channel he and Tom had used for years when they wanted to talk without the whole department listening. Tom's voice came through, barely a whisper, heavy with pain and exhaustion. He was in a box canyon 2 miles northeast of their current position. He'd been shot in the leg and had maybe 20 rounds left. The shooter was well armed, patient, and clearly knew these mountains. Tom had managed to ford up in some rocks, but it was only a matter of time. He couldn't run anymore. He couldn't even walk. Mike pressed the transmit button and told Tom to hold on. Help was coming. He didn't say that help was just him and a retired K9. Mike and Shadow pushed through increasingly difficult terrain, climbing over deadfall and scrambling up steep granite faces. The box canyon Tom had described was a tactical nightmare, a dead end with high walls on 3 sides and only one way in or out. If the shooter controlled that entrance, Tom was trapped like an animal in a cage. Mike's mind was already working the problem. A direct assault was suicide. One man against an unknown number of shooters in a defensive position would end badly. But Shadow changed the equation. A K9 could go places humans couldn't, could move silently through brush that would betray a man's position with every step, could attack from angles no one expected. They'd done it dozens of times before, back when they both wore the badge. Mike and Shadow had perfected a technique they called the ghost run. Mike would create a distraction, draw attention, and fire, while Shadow circled wide and came in from an unexpected vector. It had never failed them. Of course, they'd also always had backup, air support, and a tactical team standing by. Today it was just the two of them. 20 minutes later, Mike reached a ridgeline that gave him his first view of the box canyon below. It was exactly as bad as he'd feared. The canyon was roughly oval-shaped, maybe 200 yards long and 80 yards wide, with vertical rock walls rising 40 feet on 3 sides. The floor was covered in scattered boulders and patches of scrub pine. Mike could see Tom's position immediately, a small cluster of rocks near the back wall where he'd managed to create some cover. Tom was barely visible, just a flash of tan uniform shirt behind gray stone. The entrance to the canyon was a narrow gap, maybe 15 feet wide, choked with fallen timber and large rocks. Perfect for an ambush. And there, positioned in the rocks on the north side of the entrance, Mike spotted the shooter. Actually, shooters. Plural. Mike counted 3 distinct positions, 3 men working together to keep Tom pinned down. They were taking turns, one firing, while the others conserved ammunition, keeping Tom from making any move to escape or improve his position. These weren't amateurs. They were coordinated, disciplined, and very well equipped. Mike pulled out his binoculars and studied the shooters more carefully. All 3 wore civilian hunting clothes, earth tones that blended with the forest. All 3 carried AR-style rifles with optics. The man in the center position, clearly the leader, also had what looked like a satellite phone clipped to his vest. Mike's jaw tightened. This was planned. These men had come prepared to kill a sheriff and make sure no one found the body for a very long time. The Mackenzie murders flashed through Mike's mind. He remembered the crime scene photos, the way the bodies had been positioned, the level of violence that spoke of rage and control mixed together. Tom had been right. The official story was wrong. And now the real killers were trying to eliminate the one man who'd never stopped looking for them. Mike backed away from the ridge and found a sheltered spot where he could brief Shadow. He pulled out his trail map and sketched the canyon layout in the dirt, a habit from their K-9 team days when planning an operation. Shadow watched intently, his head cocked, as Mike drew lines and circles, marking the positions of the shooters and Tom's location. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Mike would work his way around to the south side of the canyon and create a distraction at the entrance. Something loud, something that would demand the shooters' immediate attention. While they were focused on Mike, Shadow would come in from the north, the high side, moving along the canyon rim until he was above and behind the shooter's position. Then Shadow would do what he did best. Attack on command. Take down threats. Create chaos. In that chaos, Mike would push through the entrance and get to Tom. They'd extract under covering fire, using smoke grenades if necessary, and get the hell out of these mountains. It was a terrible plan. It relied on everything going exactly right, on Shadow executing perfectly, on Mike not getting shot in the first 30 seconds, on Tom still being able to move at all. But it was the only plan they had. Mike checked his watch. It was 9:23 in the morning. He gave himself until 10 o'clock to get into position. That gave Shadow 37 minutes to make his circle and get above the shooters. Mike looked at his old partner one more time and gave the command they'd practiced 1,000 times but hoped they'd never really need. Shadow's ears went forward. His body dropped into a tactical crouch, and then he was gone, vanishing into the forest like smoke. Mike moved carefully around the south side of the canyon, staying well back from the rim, using every bit of cover the forest provided. He could hear occasional gunfire echoing from the canyon as the shooters continued their harassment of Tom's position. They were in no hurry. They had all the time in the world, and they knew it. Tom didn't. Mike reached his position with 3 minutes to spare. He was 40 yards from the canyon entrance, hidden in a thick stand of lodgepole pine. From here he could see the gap clearly, could see the defensive positions the shooters had created. They'd done good work, he had to admit. Overlapping fields of fire, solid cover, clear sightlines. They'd obviously done this before, or had military training. Mike pulled out his remaining magazines and lined them up on a flat rock beside him. 4 mags plus 1 in the weapon meant he had 76 rounds total, against 3 men with rifles and superior positions. The math wasn't good. But math didn't account for Shadow. It didn't account for the fury of a German shepherd protecting his pack. It didn't account for the bond between a K-9 and his handler, A bond stronger than fear or common sense. At exactly 10 o'clock, Mike keyed his radio. Shadow would hear the double click even from hundreds of yards away. It was the signal. Go active. Execute the plan. Mike waited 30 seconds, giving Shadow time to get into his final position. Then he grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it as hard as he could toward the canyon entrance. It hit with a sharp crack against stone. The effect was immediate. All three shooters shifted their attention toward the sound, weapons coming up. Mike threw another rock, this time from a slightly different angle. The shooters were talking to each other now, voices low but urgent. They knew someone else was out there. Mike smiled grimly. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. He identified himself as Mike Cross, former detective, and told them they were surrounded. It was a complete lie. They weren't surrounded. It was just Mike and a dog. But the shooters didn't know that. One of them fired a burst toward Mike's position, bullets ripping through the pines 10 feet to his left. Mike dropped flat and crawled rapidly to a new position. He needed to keep them engaged, keep them focused on him, keep them from looking behind them where Shadow would be closing in. What the shooters didn't know, couldn't know, was that above them on the canyon rim, Shadow had reached his attack position. The German shepherd was absolutely silent, perfectly still, watching the three men below with predatory focus. Shadow's ears were forward, his body coiled like a spring, waiting for the one sound that would release him. Mike's command. Mike fired 3 quick shots toward the canyon entrance, deliberately high, not trying to hit anyone yet. Just noise. Just distraction. The shooters returned fire, a heavier volume now, clearly getting nervous. Mike could hear them shouting to each other. They were talking about flanking him, about one of them moving to get a better angle. That was exactly what Mike wanted. He needed them thinking about tactics, thinking about how to deal with the threat in front of them. He needed them to forget about the threat above them. Mike keyed his radio again, this time with the pattern Shadow had been trained to recognize since he was a puppy. 3 short clicks, 1 long, 2 short. The pattern meant one thing and one thing only. Attack. Shadow launched himself off the canyon rim without hesitation. 80 pounds of muscle and fury, dropped 12 feet onto the rocks behind the shooter's position, landing with barely a sound. The German shepherd's training took over, years of canine work compressed into pure instinct. Shadow identified the primary threat instantly, the man in the center with the satellite phone, the leader. Shadow went for him first. The dog covered the distance in 3 powerful bounds, his jaws targeting the man's weapon arm just as he'd been trained. The shooter never saw him coming. Shadow's teeth clamped down on the man's forearm, with over 300 pounds of pressure per square inch. The rifle clattered to the rocks as the man screamed, trying to shake off the animal that seemed to materialize from nowhere. Shadow held on, thrashing his head side to side, using his body weight to drag the man off balance. The other 2 shooters spun around in confusion and horror. For a critical second, they froze, trying to process what was happening. A second was all Mike needed. Mike burst from cover and sprinted toward the canyon entrance, firing as he ran. Not accurate fire, just suppressive, bullets sparking off rocks near the shooter's positions. He was covering the 40 yards at a dead run, his lungs burning, his old football knee screaming in protest. One of the shooters managed to bring his rifle around toward Shadow. Mike put 2 rounds center mass into the man's chest. The shooter went down hard. The third shooter was swinging his weapon toward Mike now, but he was panicking, his movements jerky and rushed. Mike dropped into a slide behind a boulder just as bullets chewed up the ground where he'd been standing a moment before. Shadow had released the leader and immediately went for the third shooter, the one threatening Mike. The dog hit the man low, jaws clamping onto his calf, dragging him down. The man screamed and tried to club Shadow with his rifle stock. Shadow dodged and repositioned, going for the man's throat this time. It was the killing bite, the one K9s were trained to use only in the most extreme circumstances. Mike didn't call him off. The leader was clutching his mangled arm, trying to reach for a sidearm with his offhand. Mike came around the boulder and kicked the weapon away, then struck the man across the temple with his pistol. The leader went down and stayed down. The third shooter had stopped moving. Shadow stood over him, blood on his muzzle, his whole body vibrating with adrenaline, but completely under control. Mike gave the release command, and Shadow immediately backed off, returning to Mike's side. The entire engagement had lasted less than 20 seconds. Mike quickly searched all three men, zip-tying their hands and confiscating weapons. The man Mike had shot was dead. The third shooter was unconscious but alive, his throat torn but not fatally. The leader was coming around, groaning. Mike ignored them all and ran deeper into the canyon toward Tom's position, Shadow loping beside him. Tom was exactly where Mike had last seen him, slumped against a boulder, his face gray with pain and blood loss. His left leg was wrapped in a makeshift tourniquet made from his belt, and his jeans were soaked dark red. But his eyes were clear, and he managed a weak smile when he saw Mike. Mike knelt beside his old partner and immediately started assessing the wound. The bullet had gone through the meat of Tom's thigh, missing the femoral artery by maybe an inch. Tom was incredibly lucky. Another inch to the right, and he would have bled out in minutes. Mike pulled out his trauma kit and went to work, packing the wound with gauze, wrapping it tight with an Israeli bandage, checking Tom's vitals. Tom's pulse was elevated but strong. Blood pressure was lower than Mike liked, but not critical. Tom needed a hospital, needed a surgeon, needed IV fluids and antibiotics. But he'd live long enough to get there. While Mike worked, Tom talked, his voice weak but determined. He told Mike what he'd found. The leader out there, the one Shadow had taken down, was Daniel Reeves. 8 years ago, Daniel and his two brothers had been in business with John Mackenzie, the father of the murdered family. Mackenzie had discovered the brothers were embezzling from their logging company nearly $500,000 over 3 years. John had confronted them, threatened to go to the police. So they'd killed him, killed his wife, killed his 2 kids, made it look like a murder-suicide. Tom had spent years following dead ends, chasing rumors, piecing together fragments of evidence that the original investigation had missed or ignored. 2 months ago, he'd finally caught a break. A former employee of the logging company had reached out, guilt finally overcoming fear. The employee had seen Daniel Reeves at the Mackenzie cabin the night of the murders, had seen him leave covered in blood. But the employee had been too scared to come forward, scared of what the Reeves brothers would do to him and his family. Tom had been building a case, gathering evidence, preparing to make arrests. But somehow the Reeves brothers had found out. They'd lured Tom up here with a fake lead, planning to kill him and bury his body somewhere in these mountains where it would never be found. Tom had walked right into their trap. He'd realized it too late, had taken a bullet as he tried to get away, had barely made it to this canyon before his leg gave out. If Mike hadn't come, Tom would be dead, probably within the next hour. Mike finished securing the bandage and helped Tom to his feet. Tom couldn't put weight on his injured leg, but with Mike's support, he could hobble. They made their way slowly back toward the canyon entrance, Shadow ranging ahead, alert for any other threats. When they reached the 3 shooters, Tom looked down at Daniel Reeves with cold satisfaction. Reeves glared back with hate and pain in his eyes. He spat blood and told Tom he couldn't prove anything, that his lawyer would have him out in 24 hours, that Tom's career was over for this illegal mountain arrest. Tom just smiled and pulled out his satellite phone, the one Mike had brought. He made one call. Within minutes, Mike could hear helicopters in the distance. Tom hadn't just called the sheriff's department. He'd called the FBI. The Mackenzie case was about to become a federal investigation, and the Reeves brothers were about to discover that mountains don't hide bodies as well as they used to, especially when a decorated K-9 and his handler come looking. Mike sat down on a rock, suddenly exhausted, the adrenaline draining away and leaving him shaky. Shadow pressed against his leg, the dog's presence solid and reassuring. Mike scratched behind Shadow's ears, feeling the old scars under the gray-white fur, remembering every time this dog had saved his life or someone else's. 2 helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, an FBI tactical team, and a medical evacuation bird. They landed in the canyon, and suddenly, the quiet wilderness was full of federal agents, EMTs, and shouted commands. Tom was loaded onto a stretcher and into the medical helicopter. Before they took off, Tom grabbed Mike's hand and held it tight, his eyes saying everything his voice couldn't. Mike nodded. They were square. They'd always be square. The FBI agents were bagging evidence, photographing the scene, taking statements. The lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman named Cortez, listened to Mike's account with professional interest. She told him that the Bureau had been investigating the Reeves brothers for other crimes, money laundering and racketeering mostly. The murder charges would put them away forever. She also told Mike that his quick response had probably saved Tom's life. Mike shrugged. He'd just done what any partner would do. Agent Cortez smiled slightly and said not every partner would bring a legendary K-9 out of retirement to stage a tactical assault against 3 armed men in hostile terrain. Mike looked down at Shadow, who was lying in the sun, panting slightly, looking for all the world like an ordinary old dog tired from a long walk. Except for the blood on his muzzle and the intensity in his amber eyes, Mike and Shadow finally left the canyon around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, declining multiple offers of a helicopter ride out. Mike wanted to walk, wanted to decompress, wanted to process what had just happened. They followed the trail back down the mountain at an easy pace, the afternoon sun warm on their backs. Mike's mind was full of questions, thoughts, and second guesses. He'd just participated in an unsanctioned, tactical operation. He'd killed a man. Yes, it was clearly self-defense. Yes, the FBI had already cleared him. Yes, he'd saved Tom's life. But Mike knew how this worked. There would be an investigation, depositions, legal review. His carefully constructed retirement, his peace and quiet, was about to be shattered. Part of him was angry about that. Another part of him, the part he tried to ignore, felt more alive than he had in 3 years. Back at the trailhead, Mike's truck sat exactly where he'd left it. Tom's official SUV and the Reeves brothers' pickup were now surrounded by crime scene tape. A state trooper was standing guard, logging evidence. The trooper recognized Mike from his law enforcement days and gave him a respectful nod. Mike loaded Shadow into the truck and started the long drive home. His phone had 7 missed calls from the sheriff's department, 4 from the FBI, and 1 from a journalist who'd somehow already gotten wind of the story. Mike ignored them all. He'd deal with that tomorrow. Right now, he just wanted to get home, give Shadow the biggest steak in his freezer, and try to pretend for one more night that he was just a retired cop with a retired K-9, living a quiet life far from the violence and chaos they'd both left behind. Of course, that was the lie Mike had been telling himself for 3 years. The truth was, he and Shadow were never really retired. Not in the ways that mattered. They were just waiting. Waiting for a call. Waiting for a friend who needed help. Waiting for a reason to remember why they'd put on the badge in the first place. The drive back was quiet, except for the rumble of the engine and the occasional static from Mike's radio, which he'd finally turned back on. Dispatch was busy coordinating the FBI operation, and Mike could hear the controlled chaos of a major case breaking open. Multiple units were being deployed to arrest the other individuals connected to the Reeves brothers. Search warrants were being executed, and the media was already circling. Mike turned the radio back off. Shadow was sprawled across the back seat, finally relaxed, his breathing deep and even. The dog had given everything out there, had performed flawlessly despite being 3 years removed from active duty. Mike felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. Shadow was 10 years old. In dog years, especially for a working breed like a German shepherd, that was ancient. Every mission like today took something out of him, wore down joints and muscles that didn't recover as fast as they used to. Mike had seen too many working dogs pushed past their limits, handlers who couldn't accept that their partners were aging. He'd promised himself he wouldn't be that guy, but watching Shadow take down those shooters, seeing the intelligence and courage still burning bright in those amber eyes, Mike wondered if retirement was killing Shadow more slowly than work ever could. Working dogs lived for purpose. Without it, they faded. Mike had seen it happen. Championship K9s who retired and died within a year, not from injury or illness, but from losing their reason to get up in the morning. Maybe Shadow needed this as much as Tom had. Maybe they both did. Mike's phone rang. He considered ignoring it, but saw it was Tom's wife, Sarah. He answered. Her voice was thick with tears, but they were tears of relief. Tom was in surgery at Mercy Hospital, and the doctors were confident he'd make a full recovery. The bullet had done less damage than they'd feared, missing major blood vessels and bone. He'd be on crutches for a while, probably looking at 8 weeks of physical therapy, but he'd walk again. He'd be able to go back to work. Sarah asked Mike how she could ever thank him. Mike told her she didn't need to. Tom would have done the same. She laughed through her tears and said yes, Tom probably would have, but he wouldn't have brought a superhero dog. Mike smiled despite himself and told her Shadow sent his regards. After hanging up, Mike stopped at a small diner just outside the mountain range, one of those places that served breakfast all day and didn't ask questions about dogs in the dining area. The owner, an ex-Marine named Dutch, took one look at Mike's face and the tactical vest still in the passenger seat and simply nodded. He brought Mike coffee, brought Shadow a bowl of water and a plate of bacon, and didn't say a word. Mike ate mechanically, his body demanding fuel after the adrenaline crash. His hands were steady now, but he could feel the tremor waiting just beneath the surface, the aftermath of combat stress that never really went away. He'd learned to manage it, learned to push it down, and lock it away in the same place he kept all the other memories of things he'd done and seen. But it was always there. Shadow finished his bacon and rested his head on Mike's knee, those amber eyes looking up with complete trust. Mike scratched behind the dog's ears and felt some of the tension drain away. This was why handlers and their K9s formed such unbreakable bonds. In the moment of crisis, in the chaos of life and death, they only had each other. Mike's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Agent Cortez. She was asking if he'd be willing to come in tomorrow morning to give a full statement. She also mentioned, almost casually, that the FBI was impressed with his tactical response and his K9's performance. If Mike was interested, they occasionally contracted with private security firms for specialized operations, K9 work especially. It was good money, flexible schedule, and they could always use someone with Mike's experience. Mike read the message twice, then deleted it. He wasn't interested in going back to that life, not even as a contractor. He'd made his choice 3 years ago when he walked away from the badge. That choice had cost him his marriage, most of his friends, and his sense of purpose. But it had also given him peace, or at least the closest thing to it he was likely to find. Except here he was, less than 12 hours after deciding to help Tom, covered in dirt and gun residue, his canine still tasting blood, and feeling more centered than he had in months. Mike pushed that thought away and focused on finishing his coffee. By the time Mike pulled into his driveway, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His house was a small cabin, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, surrounded by 20 acres of pine forest. He'd bought it with his retirement money, seeking isolation and quiet, seeking a place where the ghosts couldn't follow. It had worked, mostly. Mike let Shadow out, and the dog immediately began his perimeter check, nose to the ground, working the property line just like he'd been trained. Old habits. Mike watched him for a moment, then went inside and pulled a ribeye from the freezer. He'd promised Shadow the biggest steak he had, and Mike Cross always kept his promises. While the steak thawed, Mike stripped off his clothes and stood under a hot shower, watching dirt and blood swirl down the drain. His body was a map of old injuries, scars from his years in law enforcement. A bullet graze across his ribs from a domestic call gone wrong. A knife wound on his shoulder from a bar fight he'd tried to break up. A surgical scar on his knee from the time a suspect's pit bull had grabbed him during a raid. None of them hurt anymore, not physically. But he remembered every single one. Mike cooked the steak rare, the way Shadow liked it, and set it down on the floor in the dog's bowl. Shadow attacked it with enthusiasm, and Mike smiled watching him. For all his training, all his discipline, Shadow was still a dog at heart. Simple pleasures still mattered. Mike made himself a sandwich and sat on the porch, looking out at the forest as darkness settled in. His mind kept replaying the day, analyzing decisions, critiquing his tactics. He'd gotten lucky. If the Reeves brothers had been better trained, if they'd posted a rear guard, if Shadow had been even a second slower, everything could have gone wrong. Tom could be dead. Mike could be dead. Shadow could be dead. But they weren't. They'd won. The bad guys were in custody, Tom would recover, and justice would finally come for the Mackenzie family. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, Mike just felt tired. Tired and restless and unsure what came next. Shadow finished his steak and joined Mike on the porch, settling down with his head on his paws. They sat there together in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Around 10 p.m., Mike's phone rang again. He almost didn't answer, but it was a number he didn't recognize. Curiosity won. The voice on the other end was male, older, with a cultured accent that suggested education and money. The man introduced himself as Robert Mackenzie, John Mackenzie's younger brother. He'd just heard from the FBI that arrests had been made in his brother's murder. He wanted to thank Mike personally for helping bring his family's killers to justice. Mike listened as Robert talked about his brother, about John's wife and their 2 kids, about the hole their deaths had left in the family. Robert had known the official story was wrong from the beginning, but he'd had no proof, no way to fight the system. He'd hired private investigators, offered rewards, begged the sheriff's department to keep the case open. Nothing had worked. Until Tom Bradley refused to let it go. And until Mike Cross decided to risk everything to save his old partner. Robert's voice broke as he thanked Mike again. Then he asked if they could meet, if Mike would accept a reward for what he'd done. Mike said no to the reward, but yes to the meeting. Some things couldn't be bought, but Robert deserved to look him in the eye. Mike hung up and looked down at Shadow. The dog was watching him with that knowing expression, the one that always made Mike feel like Shadow understood more than any animal should. Mike shook his head and stood up, stretching muscles that were starting to stiffen. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more complications, more reminders of the life he'd tried to leave behind. But tonight, he was just a man and his dog, safe at home after a hard day's work. That would have to be enough. Mike went inside, Shadow following close behind. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, sat down in his worn leather chair, and closed his eyes. Sleep would come eventually, filled with the usual dreams of things he couldn't change and people he couldn't save. But maybe tonight there'd be one new dream, a better one. A dream where 3 years of running from his past finally caught up to him, and instead of destroying him, it reminded him why he became a cop in the first place. To stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. To never abandon a partner. To do what was right, even when it cost everything. Especially when it cost everything. Mike woke at 5 a.m. out of habit, his body still on the old patrol schedule, despite 3 years of civilian life. Shadow was already up, sitting by the door, waiting for their morning routine. Mike pulled on running clothes, and they headed out into the pre-dawn darkness, following the trails that wound through Mike's property. The morning run was sacred time, just Mike and Shadow, and the forest coming awake around them. It was the one part of his old life that Mike had kept without compromise. Physical fitness had saved his life more times than he could count, and he refused to let retirement turn him soft. They ran 5 miles through increasingly difficult terrain, Shadow moving with the easy grace of an animal in his element, despite his age. Mike's knee complained. His lungs burned in the cold air, but he pushed through. Pain was just weakness leaving the body, or so his old drill instructor had claimed. Mike had never fully believed it, but he'd repeated it enough times that it had become its own kind of truth. Back at the cabin, Mike showered and dressed in civilian clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt. He made coffee strong enough to strip paint and scrambled eggs for himself and Shadow. At 8 a.m., Mike's phone started ringing in earnest. The sheriff's department wanted a statement. The FBI wanted a statement. The district attorney wanted a statement. A journalist from the Denver Post wanted an interview. Mike ignored them all except Agent Cortez. He agreed to come to the FBI field office at 1 p.m. to give his formal account of the mountain operation. That gave him 5 hours. Mike spent them doing what he always did when his mind was churning with too many thoughts and not enough answers. He worked with his hands. Behind his cabin was a workshop where Mike had spent the last 3 years building furniture, learning carpentry as a way to fill the empty hours. Today, he was working on a dining table, solid oak, traditional joinery, no shortcuts. The physical work helped. The focus required to measure and cut and fit pieces together. Shadow lay in a patch of sunlight near the workbench, content to watch. Around 11 o'clock, a vehicle pulled up the long driveway to Mike's cabin. Shadow was on his feet instantly, alert but not aggressive. Mike walked to the front of the cabin and saw a black Mercedes sedan, expensive and out of place in this rural setting. A man in his 60s climbed out, tall and distinguished, wearing casual but clearly expensive clothes. Robert Mackenzie. Mike had told him no meeting necessary, but apparently the man hadn't listened. Robert approached with his hand extended, and Mike shook it, feeling the grip of someone who'd worked for his money rather than inherited it. Robert's eyes were clear and direct, but there was pain there, old and deep. The pain of someone who'd lost family and never gotten justice. Until now. They sat on Mike's porch, and Robert told him the fuller story of his brother's murder. John Mackenzie had been a good man, a family man, someone who'd built a successful logging business through hard work and fair dealing. When John had discovered the Reeves brothers' embezzlement, he'd given them a chance to make it right, to pay back the money and walk away. They'd pretended to agree while planning his murder. The crime scene had been staged carefully to look like John had snapped under financial pressure and killed his family before turning the gun on himself. But Robert had known his brother. John would never have hurt his family. He would have died protecting them. Which is exactly what happened. According to the evidence Tom had finally uncovered, Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check for $250,000. He slid it across the porch table to Mike. Payment for bringing his brother's killers to justice. for giving his family closure, for doing what the system had failed to do for 8 years. Mike stared at the check for a long moment, then pushed it back across the table. He told Robert he appreciated the gesture, but he couldn't accept payment for helping a friend. Tom Bradley had been his partner, his brother in everything but blood. You don't charge family for having their back. Robert smiled, a sad knowing smile, and said he'd expected that answer. He put the check away and pulled out a business card instead. He told Mike that if he ever needed anything at all, to call. Robert Mackenzie had resources, connections, and a long memory for those who'd done right by his family. Mike took the card, knowing he'd probably never use it, but understanding the gesture for what it was. A debt acknowledged, even if not formally repaid. They talked for another hour, Robert sharing stories of his brother and his brother's family. Good memories from before the tragedy. Mike found himself relaxing, drawn in by Robert's storytelling. When Robert finally left, Mike felt lighter somehow, as if he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't known was there. Shadow came over and pressed against his leg, and Mike realized the dog had been monitoring the entire conversation, reading body language and tone, ready to intervene if Robert had posed any threat. Always on duty. Always protecting. Mike scratched behind Shadow's ears and told him he was a good boy. The best boy. At 12:30, Mike loaded Shadow into his truck and headed to the FBI field office. The drive took 20 minutes through increasingly suburban sprawl, small towns that had grown into bedroom communities for the city beyond. Mike hated this kind of development, the way it ate up wild spaces and replaced them with strip malls and housing developments. But he kept his opinions to himself. The FBI office was a modern building, all glass and steel, with security that would make a paranoid dictator feel safe. Mike went through the screening process, submitted to having his weapon locked in a secure locker, and was escorted to a conference room where Agent Cortez was waiting with 2 other agents and a stenographer. The interview took 3 hours. Mike walked them through every detail of the mountain operation, from Tom's initial call to the final helicopter extraction. He was honest about his tactical decisions, his use of Shadow as a force multiplier, his judgment call to engage 3 armed suspects with minimal backup. The agents listened without interruption, taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification. When Mike finished, Agent Cortez leaned back in her chair and studied him for a long moment. Then she told him that based on his statement and their crime scene analysis, the FBI was ruling the entire incident as justified use of force in defense of another officer. The man Mike had killed had fired first, had been part of a conspiracy to commit murder, and Mike's actions had directly resulted in saving Sheriff Bradley's life. There would be paperwork, but no charges, no investigation, no career-ending scandal. Mike felt something unknot in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he'd been bracing for the other shoe to drop, for this to turn into another bureaucratic nightmare that would drag on for months or years. Agent Cortez wasn't finished, though. She told Mike that the FBI had recovered extensive evidence from the Reeves brothers' properties, including journals, financial records, and communications that detailed not just the Mackenzie murders, but several other crimes spanning 2 decades. The brothers had been involved in everything from drug trafficking to contract killing. They'd built a criminal empire, hiding behind the legitimate facade of their logging business. Tom's investigation had blown the whole thing open. Dozens of cases would be reopened now. Dozens of families would finally get answers. And it had all started because one stubborn sheriff refused to accept the obvious answer, and one retired detective was willing to risk everything to save him. Cortez smiled slightly and repeated her offer from yesterday. The FBI could use someone like Mike, someone with his skills and his moral compass, someone who knew when the rules mattered and when they didn't. Mike thanked her but declined again. He was done with that life. Cortez nodded, unsurprised, and told him the offer would remain open. Mike left the FBI office feeling strangely deflated. He'd expected relief, maybe even satisfaction, but instead he just felt empty. The mission was over. Tom was safe. The bad guys were in custody. Justice was being served. So why did he feel like something was missing? Shadow seemed to sense his mood and pressed close as they walked back to the truck. Mike drove home on autopilot, his mind turning over the day's events. He'd been living in a kind of limbo for 3 years, neither fully retired nor fully engaged with the world. Going through the motions of civilian life while his real self, the cop he'd been for 2 decades, remained in suspended animation. Yesterday's mountain operation had woken that part of him back up, and now Mike didn't know how to put it back to sleep. Back at the cabin, Mike tried to return to his normal routine. He worked in his shop, prepared dinner, went through his evening rituals. But everything felt hollow, performative. Shadow watched him with concern, the dog's emotional intelligence picking up on Mike's inner turmoil. Around 8 p.m., Mike's phone rang. It was Tom, calling from his hospital room. His voice was stronger than Mike expected, only lightly slurred from pain medication. Tom thanked Mike again for saving his life, then got to the real reason for his call. The sheriff was retiring at the end of the month, health issues finally catching up to him. There would be an election to replace him, and Tom was being pressured to run. He had the experience, the respect of the community, and now, the heroic story of taking down a major criminal organization. He'd win easily, but Tom didn't want the political life that came with being an elected sheriff. He wanted to work cases, to be in the field, to do the job rather than manage it. So he declined. But he'd recommended someone else for the position. Someone with 20 years of investigative experience. Someone who knew how to lead. Someone who just demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure. Someone named Mike Cross. Mike started to protest, but Tom cut him off. He told Mike that he'd been watching him for 3 years, watching him slowly die of boredom and purposelessness. Mike was a cop. It was who he was, not just what he did. Walking away from it hadn't brought him peace, just a slower kind of suffering. Tom believed Mike had left the force not because he wanted to, but because he'd been burned out, disgusted by the politics and bureaucracy that had slowly consumed modern law enforcement. But things were changing. The community wanted real leadership, wanted someone who cared more about justice than career advancement. They wanted someone like Mike. Tom finished by saying he'd already spoken to several county commissioners, and they were all interested. If Mike wanted the job, it was his. No election, just an appointment until the next scheduled election cycle. Time to make a real difference again. Mike sat in silence after Tom hung up, staring at nothing. Sheriff. He'd never wanted to be sheriff. Too much politics, too much administration, too much time pushing paper instead of working cases. But Tom was right about one thing. The last 3 years hadn't been living, just existing. And yesterday, for a few hours, Mike had felt alive again. Had felt like he mattered. Shadow came over and laid his head on Mike's lap, looking up with those knowing amber eyes. Mike ran his hand through the dog's gray-white fur and made a decision. He picked up his phone and made a call. The next morning, Mike Cross walked into the county commissioner's office wearing a suit he'd bought 3 years ago for job interviews he'd never attended. By noon, he'd been offered the position of interim sheriff. He'd accepted, with 2 conditions. First, Tom Bradley would be his chief deputy. Second, the department would reinstate its K-9 program with Shadow as the lead dog. Both conditions were accepted without hesitation. Mike Cross was going back to work. And so was Shadow, The news of Mike's appointment as interim sheriff spread through the county faster than wildfire. By evening, his phone was flooded with congratulations from old colleagues, concerns from those who'd watched him burn out 3 years ago, and cautious inquiries from citizens, wondering if the county had just hired someone who'd staged an unauthorized military operation in the mountains. Mike ignored most of it and focused on the work. He had 30 days before officially taking office, 30 days to prepare himself and his department for what he knew would be a difficult transition. The current sheriff, Buck Ramsey, was old school in all the worst ways. He'd let the department slide into complacency, more focused on keeping the county commissioners happy than actually solving crimes. Crime rates had climbed steadily over his tenure, clearance rates had dropped, and morale among the deputies was at an all-time low. Mike knew he'd be inheriting a mess. The first thing Mike did was spend a week riding along with different deputies, getting a feel for how the department actually operated versus how it looked on paper. What he found was worse than he'd feared. Equipment was outdated, training was minimal, and there was a culture of cutting corners that had infected every level of the organization. Most troubling was the attitude toward K-9 units. The department had disbanded its K-9 program 2 years ago, claiming budget constraints. In reality, Buck Ramsey just didn't see the value in working dogs. He viewed them as expensive and high maintenance, not worth the investment. Mike spent hours with the department's budget, looking for ways to fund the program's restoration. He cut unnecessary expenditures, reallocated funds from administration to operations, and called in favors from his years in law enforcement. By the end of his second week as sheriff-designate, Mike had secured enough funding to not only bring back the K-9 program, but expand it. Shadow would be the lead dog, but Mike wanted to recruit and train at least 2 more K-9 teams. Young dogs this time, with handlers who could give them full careers. Shadow's role would evolve into something different, a specialized position that played to his experience while acknowledging his age. Mike envisioned Shadow as a teaching dog, helping train new K-9s and their handlers, while also being available for operations that required his specific skill set. High-stakes tracking, suspect apprehension, hostage situations. The kind of work where experience mattered more than youth. Tom Bradley was enthusiastic about the plan. He'd been recovering well from his leg wound, already doing physical therapy and pushing his doctors to clear him for field duty. Tom understood what Mike was building better than anyone. They'd both come up in an era of law enforcement that valued community policing, building relationships, knowing your jurisdiction not just as a map, but as a living community of people you were sworn to protect. That approach had been slowly dying under budget cuts and the militarization of police forces across the country. Mike wanted to bring it back. He wanted deputies who knew the people they served, who could solve problems without always resorting to arrest and prosecution. But Mike also understood the reality of modern threats. The Reeves brothers case had proven that serious criminals were operating in rural areas, using isolation and lack of resources as cover. Mike needed a department that could handle both ends of the spectrum, from helping lost hikers to taking down organized crime. It was a delicate balance, and Mike spent his nights planning how to achieve it. Shadow had his own adjustment to make. The dog had spent 3 years in retirement, and while yesterday's mountain operation had proven he still had the skills, Mike knew they couldn't rely on muscle memory alone. Mike reached out to his old K-9 training instructor, a retired Marine named Sarah Chen, who now ran a private K-9 training facility. Sarah agreed to work with Shadow on a refresher course, updating his skills and assessing his current capabilities honestly. The first training session was humbling. Shadow was still incredibly talented, his nose and instincts as sharp as ever. But his body showed its age. He couldn't jump as high, couldn't run as long, needed more recovery time between exercises. Sarah pulled Mike aside and gave him the truth he'd been avoiding. Shadow had maybe 2 more years of operational work in him, perhaps less if they pushed him too hard. After that, the risk of serious injury would outweigh his effectiveness. Mike needed to use these 2 years wisely, focus Shadow on training and mentoring rather than daily operations. Let younger dogs handle the routine work. Save Shadow for when they really needed him. Mike agreed, even though part of him wanted to argue, wanted to believe Shadow was invincible. The day Mike officially took office as sheriff, the ceremony was held in the county courthouse, a historic building that had stood for over 100 years. The room was packed with deputies, county officials, citizens, and media. Mike stood at the podium in his new uniform, the sheriff's badge heavy on his chest, and gave a speech he'd written and rewritten a dozen times. He talked about his vision for the department, his commitment to both protecting and serving the community, his belief that good law enforcement required both strength and compassion. He talked about the importance of never giving up on justice, no matter how cold a case got, referencing the Mackenzie murders without naming them directly. And he introduced his chief deputy, Tom Bradley, to a standing ovation from everyone who knew Tom's story. Then Mike did something no sheriff in the county's history had ever done. He had Shadow brought up on stage. The German shepherd, wearing his official K9 vest, stood beside Mike as he announced the restoration and expansion of the county's K9 program. Mike explained that working dogs weren't just tools, they were partners, and they represented the kind of relationship-based policing he wanted to build. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The local news ran the story that night, featuring footage of Shadow and highlighting Mike's unorthodox path to becoming sheriff. Social media exploded with support, though there were critics who questioned whether someone who'd left law enforcement in frustration could successfully lead a department. Mike ignored the critics and focused on the work. His first week was a whirlwind of administrative meetings, policy reviews, and personnel decisions. Mike quickly identified deputies who shared his vision and promoted them to key positions. He also identified those who were part of the problem, the ones who'd thrived under Buck Ramsey's lazy leadership. Mike gave them a choice: adapt to the new standards or find employment elsewhere. Most chose to adapt. A few resigned, and Mike let them go without regret. By the end of his second week, the department's culture was already shifting. Deputies who'd been coasting were suddenly being held accountable. Training standards were being raised. Equipment was being upgraded. And citizens were noticing the difference. Response times improved. Crime reports were being followed up on instead of filed away. The sheriff's office felt like it had a pulse again. Then Mike got his first major case as sheriff. A 12-year-old girl named Emma Foster had disappeared from a trailhead at the edge of the county. She'd been hiking with her family, had wandered off trail to photograph wildflowers, and had never come back. Search and rescue teams had been looking for 2 days with no success. The family was desperate, and the media was turning it into a circus. Mike looked at the search maps, studied the terrain, and made a decision. He was bringing in Shadow. Sarah Chen objected, reminding Mike of their agreement to limit Shadow's operational deployments. But Mike had a feeling about this case, the kind of intuition that came from 20 years of investigation. Emma Foster wasn't lost. She'd been taken. And if that was true, every hour mattered. Mike loaded Shadow into his department vehicle and drove to the trailhead, arriving at dusk. The search and rescue coordinator briefed him on their efforts. They'd covered a 10-mile radius, used helicopters with thermal imaging, called in volunteer teams from 3 counties. Nothing. Mike asked for Emma's backpack, the one she'd left behind when she disappeared. He had Shadow smell it, watching the dog's body language carefully. Shadow's reaction was immediate and definite. He had a scent, and it wasn't heading deeper into the wilderness. It was heading toward the parking lot. Mike felt his gut tighten. His instinct had been right. Someone had taken Emma, and they'd driven away with her. But Shadow was pulling toward a specific direction, not toward the main access road, but toward an old logging road that most of the search teams had dismissed as too overgrown for vehicle access. Mike grabbed his radio and called in Tom Bradley and 2 tactical deputies. Then he and Shadow started following the trail. The logging road was indeed overgrown, but Mike could see recent tire tracks. Someone with a high-clearance vehicle had come through here within the last couple of days. Shadow pulled harder on his lead, his whole body focused on the scent trail. They followed it for nearly 3 miles, the forest getting darker and more isolated. Finally, Shadow stopped at a turnoff that led to an old hunter's cabin, barely visible through the trees. Mike's training took over. He called for backup to hold position at the logging road entrance, then moved forward with just Shadow and 1 tactical deputy for cover. They approached the cabin carefully, using the trees for concealment. There was a vehicle parked behind the cabin, a late-model SUV with mud covering the plates. Through a window, Mike could see movement inside. Someone was home. Mike made the decision to hit the cabin hard and fast. If Emma was in there, if she was still alive, waiting for a lengthy negotiation could get her killed. He radioed his team, counted down, and then kicked in the door with his weapon drawn. Shadow burst in beside him, barking with an intensity that would freeze anyone in their tracks. Inside the cabin was a man in his 40s, standing over a young girl who was bound to a chair. Emma Foster. She was terrified but alive. The man reached for a weapon on the table beside him. Shadow hit him like a missile, knocking him away from the gun and to the floor. Mike had the man in handcuffs within seconds. Emma was sobbing with relief and terror, and Mike's tactical deputy carefully cut her bonds while radioing for medical support. The man on the floor was identified as Dale Richter, a convicted sex offender who'd been living off-grid in the mountains for the past 3 years. Mike felt rage boiling in his chest, but kept his voice cold and professional as he read Richter his rights. The man never said a word, just glared with the dead eyes of a predator caught in a trap. Emma was reunited with her family within the hour, and the media descended on the scene like locusts. Mike gave a brief statement, crediting Shadow with the breakthrough in the case, then got out of there before the reporters could ask more questions. He didn't want attention. He just wanted to do the job. Back at his cabin that night, Mike sat on his porch with Shadow beside him and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Satisfaction. Not the adrenaline high of a successful tactical operation, but the deeper satisfaction of knowing they'd made a real difference. A little girl was home safe with her family because Mike had trusted his instincts, and because Shadow had done what he did best. This was why Mike had become a cop in the first place. This was what he'd been missing for 3 years. Purpose. The Emma Foster case transformed Mike's tenure as sheriff from tentative to established almost overnight. The successful rescue dominated local and even national news for days. Mike gave minimal interviews, deflecting credit to his team, and particularly to Shadow, but his name and face became synonymous with a new approach to law enforcement in the county. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Donations flooded in for the K-9 program, and several retired law enforcement officers reached out asking if Mike needed additional experienced personnel. He hired 2 of them. With Tom Bradley handling day-to-day operations, Mike was able to focus on the bigger picture, building systems and protocols that would outlast his tenure as sheriff. He created a cold case unit, knowing there were families like the Mackenzies who deserved justice no matter how much time had passed. He established community outreach programs, getting deputies into schools and neighborhood meetings to rebuild trust that had eroded over years of neglect. And he expanded the K-9 program according to his original vision. 2 new K-9 teams were recruited and began training under Sarah Chen's guidance, with Shadow serving as the demonstration dog. Watching Shadow work with the younger dogs was fascinating. The old German shepherd had a calm authority that the young K-9s instinctively responded to, and their handlers learned as much from watching Shadow as from any formal instruction. Shadow was teaching them the difference between what could be trained and what could only be earned through experience. The subtleties of reading a scent trail in difficult conditions, the judgment to know when to push hard and when to hold back, the trust between handler and dog that made everything else possible. Mike found himself learning too, seeing his old partner through new eyes. For years he'd taken Shadow's abilities for granted, the way you do with someone you work with every day. Now, watching young handlers struggle with basics that Shadow made look effortless, Mike gained a deeper appreciation for just how exceptional his dog really was. But Mike also saw the signs of aging that couldn't be ignored. Shadow moved more slowly in the mornings, his joints stiff until he'd warmed up. He needed longer recovery periods after training sessions. His hearing wasn't quite as sharp as it used to be. Sarah Chen reminded Mike regularly that Shadow was on borrowed time as an operational K-9, 3 months into Mike's tenure as sheriff. The department got a call that would test everything they'd built. A domestic situation in a rural part of the county had escalated into a hostage crisis. A man named Kevin Walsh had barricaded himself in his home with his wife and 2 teenage children, armed with multiple weapons and making increasingly erratic threats. Deputies had responded to a domestic violence call from a neighbor who'd heard screaming. When they arrived, Walsh had fired shots in their direction and retreated into the house with his family. Mike arrived on scene within 20 minutes, establishing command and calling in the department's tactical team. Tom Bradley was running the perimeter, making sure no civilians got close to the danger zone. Mike tried to establish communication with Walsh, using a bullhorn and the house phone, but Walsh wouldn't respond. All they could hear from inside was shouting and crying. The tactical team leader, a former SWAT officer named Marcus Johnson, who Mike had recruited from the city, presented options. They could wait Walsh out, hoping he'd surrender peacefully. They could try a negotiator, though Walsh wasn't responding to communication attempts. Or they could breach the house. Except the high-risk nature of a dynamic entry, Mike hated all 3 options. Waiting gave Walsh time to hurt or kill his family. A negotiator couldn't negotiate with someone who wouldn't talk. And a breach would almost certainly result in gunfire, with the family directly in the line of fire. Marcus suggested a 4th option, something they'd practiced but never used operationally. A stealth K-9 insertion. Shadow could enter the house through an unsecured entry point, assess the situation visually, and either create a distraction, allowing for tactical entry, or, if the situation was immediately life-threatening, engage Walsh directly. It was risky. Shadow would be going in alone, without backup, into an environment where friendly fire was a real possibility. But it might give them the intelligence they needed to save the family. Mike looked at Shadow, who was sitting calmly beside the command vehicle, watching everything with alert interest. The dog met his eyes, and Mike saw the same readiness he'd seen 100 times before. Shadow wasn't scared. He was waiting for the command to work. Mike made the call. They do the stealth insertion. The back of the Walsh house had a dog door. Ironically enough, that Shadow could fit through. Marcus and his tactical team moved into position around the house, ready to breach on Mike's signal. Sarah Chen, who'd arrived on scene to help with the operation, fitted Shadow with a small camera harness that would transmit video back to Mike's tablet. It was technology the old K9 unit had never had, but Mike had prioritized it in the new program budget. Now he'd find out if it was worth the investment. Mike knelt down beside Shadow and gave him the briefing, speaking softly, using hand signals and voice commands to explain what he needed. Shadow would enter the house quietly, move through it assessing threats, and wait for Mike's command to either engage or retreat. If Walsh pointed a weapon at any family member, Shadow had authorization to attack without waiting for a signal. The rules of engagement were clear. Protect the innocent at all costs. Shadow's tail gave a single thump against the ground. Message received. Mike released Shadow toward the back of the house, and the German shepherd moved like a ghost, low and silent, disappearing into the shadowed yard. On Mike's tablet, grainy video began streaming from Shadow's camera. The perspective was disorienting at first, seeing the world from dog height, but Mike adjusted quickly. Shadow slipped through the dog door with barely a sound, emerging into a mudroom. The audio pickup on the camera caught Walsh's voice from somewhere in the house, slurred with alcohol and rage, shouting at his wife. Shadow moved forward carefully, his training evident in every controlled movement. Through a doorway into a kitchen. Empty. Through another doorway into a living room. There. Mike's breath caught. Walsh was standing in the center of the room, a rifle in his hands but pointed at the floor. His wife sat on a couch, her face bruised and swollen, holding one of their teenage daughters. The son, maybe 16, stood against the far wall, hands raised. Walsh was ranting about respect, about how his family didn't appreciate what he did for them, about how he'd rather see them dead than disrespecting him. Classic domestic abuser language, escalating toward violence. Shadow held position just out of sight, watching and waiting. Mike studied the layout through the camera feed. Walsh's back was partially to Shadow's position. His finger wasn't on the rifle's trigger yet, but that could change in an instant. Mike made his decision. He signaled Marcus to get ready for breach, then focused on Shadow's camera feed. He whispered into the radio microphone connected to Shadow's harness, knowing the dog would hear him through the earpiece built into the tactical vest. Mike gave 3 commands in sequence. Move forward, get Walsh's attention, hold position unless he threatens the family. On screen, Shadow began moving. The German shepherd emerged from the doorway into Walsh's peripheral vision, not attacking, just appearing. His presence solid and undeniable. Walsh spun toward Shadow, bringing the rifle up. Shadow held position, standing his ground, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Walsh's wife used the distraction. She shoved her daughter toward the door and screamed for both kids to run. They bolted. Walsh tried to track them with the rifle, and that was when Shadow struck. 80 pounds of trained K9 hit Walsh in the chest, jaws clamping onto the man's weapon arm. The rifle discharged into the ceiling as Walsh went down. Marcus and the tactical team breached simultaneously, flooding through the front door in a coordinated rush. Within seconds, Walsh was disarmed and in handcuffs, and Shadow had backed off on Mike's command. The family was safe. No officers were injured. And Shadow had executed a perfect tactical insertion under high-risk conditions. As Mike entered the house and approached Shadow, the dog's tail was wagging, not with excitement but with satisfaction. Job done. Mike knelt down and ran his hands over Shadow, checking for any injuries. The dog was fine, not even breathing hard. Mike felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name, pride and relief and love all mixed together. This animal had just voluntarily entered a situation where he could have been shot, had assessed a complex tactical scenario, and had executed his mission flawlessly. All because Mike had asked him to. All because that was their deal, their partnership, their unbreakable bond. Sarah Chen approached as medics were checking the family, and Walsh was being loaded into a patrol car. She'd watched the whole thing on the video feed, and her expression was a mixture of admiration and concern. She told Mike what he already knew. Shadow had just performed at a level very few canines ever reached, showing judgment and restraint that went beyond training into something like tactical genius. But operations like this took something out of older dogs, stress that didn't show immediately, but accumulated over time. Mike asked her directly how many more operations like this Shadow could handle. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. Maybe 5. Maybe 10. Maybe 1. There was no way to know until the dog's body simply couldn't do it anymore. Every working dog had a last mission, a point where age and accumulated injuries finally caught up. The trick was recognizing that point before it resulted in the dog getting killed. Sarah reminded Mike that he had 2 new K9 teams almost ready for operational deployment. Young dogs with years of service ahead of them. Shadow could step back, could focus purely on training and public relations, could retire with honor before his last mission became a tragedy. Mike knew she was right. He knew every word she said made logical sense. But looking at Shadow, seeing the vitality still burning in those amber eyes, Mike couldn't imagine taking this away from him. Working was what Shadow lived for. Retirement had nearly killed him once already. Mike made a promise to Sarah and to himself. He'd be more selective about deploying Shadow operationally. He'd save his partner for situations where his experience and judgment were truly needed, not routine work the younger dogs could handle. But he wouldn't retire Shadow until the dog himself told him it was time. 6 months into Mike's tenure as sheriff, the department had been transformed. Crime rates were down, clearance rates were up, and community trust had been largely restored. The K9 program was thriving, with the 2 new teams operational, and Shadow serving as the program's face and training leader. Mike had also quietly solved 4 cold cases, including a missing person case from 15 years ago that had haunted the previous sheriff's administration. The county commissioners had made it clear they wanted Mike to run for sheriff in the next election, make his interim position permanent. Mike was still undecided. He was doing the work he'd been meant to do, making a real difference in his community. But the political aspects of being sheriff still bothered him. The need to maintain relationships with commissioners and state legislators, the budget fights, the media management. Mike was a cop, not a politician, and he worried about losing himself in the administrative side of the job. Tom Bradley had no such concerns. He told Mike flat out that if Mike didn't run, Tom would resign. He'd come back to law enforcement specifically to work with Mike, to be part of rebuilding the department the right way. If Mike walked away again, Tom was done too. Shadow was also doing well, though Mike watched him carefully for signs of decline. The dog still loved training days, still showed intensity and focus on operations, but Mike could see the subtle changes. A slight hesitation before jumping into the truck. A preference for lying down rather than sitting. The way he'd sleep more deeply than he used to, sometimes not waking immediately when Mike called his name. They were small things, easy to dismiss individually, but together they painted a picture Mike didn't want to see. His partner was getting old. One evening in late autumn, Mike got a call from Robert McKenzie, the first time they'd spoken since Robert's visit to Mike's cabin. Robert's voice was excited as he explained that the FBI's investigation into the Reeves brothers had uncovered evidence linking them to a major human trafficking operation. The brothers had been using their logging trucks to transport victims across state lines, part of a network that had been operating for over a decade. Robert had been working with victims' advocacy groups to help survivors, and he wanted Mike's input on how local law enforcement could better identify and respond to trafficking operations in rural areas. Mike agreed to meet with Robert and his advocacy group, and found himself drawn into a world he'd been only peripherally aware of. Human trafficking in rural America was an invisible epidemic, hidden in plain sight because people assumed it was purely an urban problem. Robert's group was working to train law enforcement to recognize the signs, to understand that the woman at the truck stop who seemed drugged, or the teenager at the motel with an older man, might not be there voluntarily. Mike brought this knowledge back to his department, implementing new training protocols and establishing relationships with federal agencies working on trafficking cases. Within 2 months, Mike's deputies had identified and assisted in rescuing 3 trafficking victims, leading to arrests that made national news. The sheriff's office was becoming known not just for solving traditional crimes, but for taking on complex issues that most rural departments ignored. Mike's reputation continued to grow, but so did the demands on his time. He was spending more hours in meetings and less in the field, exactly what he'd feared would happen. Shadow seemed to sense Mike's frustration and would often press against his leg during particularly tedious administrative sessions. As if reminding him why they'd come back to law enforcement in the first place, winter arrived hard and fast, with a major storm system dumping 3 feet of snow across the county in one weekend. Mike's department worked around the clock, helping stranded motorists, checking on isolated residents, coordinating with power companies to restore service. It was during this storm that Mike got a call that would test Shadow one final time. A small plane had crashed in the mountains, a private aircraft carrying a family of 4 back from a ski vacation. The crash site had been located by emergency beacon, but it was in extremely difficult terrain, accessible only by helicopter or a brutal overland trek. Weather had grounded all helicopters, and time was critical. Anyone who'd survived the crash would be dealing with severe injuries, hypothermia, and rapidly worsening conditions. The nearest search and rescue team with mountain experience was 5 hours away. Mike looked at his available resources, at the maps showing the crash site's location, and made a decision that he knew Sarah Chen would object to. He was taking Shadow and going after those people. Tom Bradley insisted on coming too, despite his leg still not being fully healed from his own mountain ordeal. Mike assembled a small team himself, Tom, Shadow, and 2 deputies with winter wilderness experience. They geared up with everything they'd need for a rescue operation in extreme conditions, loaded into Mike's truck, and drove as far as the snow-covered roads would allow. Then they continued on snowshoes, following a GPS track toward the crash site. The trek was brutal. 4 miles through deep snow, elevation gain of over 2,000 feet, temperature hovering around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Mike pushed hard, knowing every minute mattered, but he also watched Shadow carefully. The old German shepherd was struggling more than Mike had ever seen him struggle before. Shadow's breathing was labored, his pace slower than normal. He was giving everything he had, pushing through pain and exhaustion, but age was finally catching up to him. Mike stopped to check on Shadow, offering water and a chance to rest. Shadow drank but refused to stop, pulling at his harness, insisting on moving forward. The dog knew people needed help. That was all that mattered. They reached the crash site 90 minutes after starting their trek. The small plane had come down in a narrow ravine, one wing sheared off, fuselage crumpled. It looked unsurvivable, but as they approached, Mike heard something. A child crying. They'd found survivors. The father was dead, killed on impact. The mother was critically injured, unconscious and barely breathing. But their 2 children, girls aged 7 and 9, were alive, trapped in the wreckage, but protected by their father's body, which had taken the brunt of the impact. Mike and his team worked quickly, stabilizing the mother, extracting the children, administering first aid. Tom was on the radio coordinating helicopter extraction now that they had eyes on the crash site. The weather was starting to clear, and a bird might be able to get in within the hour. But they needed to move the survivors to a clearing 400 yards away where a helicopter could land. Mike looked at the mother. She needed a stretcher and careful handling. The children could walk, but were suffering from shock and hypothermia, needed constant monitoring. It was going to take all 5 rescuers to get everyone out safely, which meant no one would be available to help Shadow, who Mike could see was at the end of his reserves. The old dog was lying in the snow, panting heavily, ice forming in his fur. Sarah Chen's warnings echoed in Mike's mind. This might be Shadow's last mission. The dog had given everything to get here, but Mike wasn't sure he had enough left to make the trek back out. Mike made a decision that tore at his heart. He'd carry Shadow out. Tom and the 2 deputies would handle the survivors. Mike would use his own strength to get his partner to safety, even if it meant pushing himself beyond his own limits. Tom objected, pointing out that Mike's help with the stretcher was crucial. But Mike was firm. Shadow had carried him through 20 years of law enforcement, had saved his life more than once. Today, Mike would return the favor. They loaded the mother onto the improvised stretcher, wrapped the children in emergency blankets, and began the trek to the extraction point. Mike fashioned a harness from climbing rope and carefully secured Shadow against his chest, the 80-pound dog a warm weight that made every step a battle against gravity and exhaustion. The clearing seemed impossibly far away, and Mike's legs were screaming, his lungs burning in the frozen air. But he kept moving, one step at a time, Shadow's breathing warm against his chest. They reached the clearing as the helicopter appeared over the ridge, a beautiful sound in the wilderness silence. The survivors were loaded quickly, the mother and children strapped in, medics already working. Tom grabbed Mike's arm and told him to get on the helicopter too. Mike was hypothermic, exhausted to the point of collapse, and Shadow needed immediate veterinary attention. Mike wanted to argue, wanted to insist he could make the hike back out, but his body was shutting down. He let Tom help him and Shadow into the helicopter. As they lifted off, Mike held Shadow close and whispered thanks into the dog's ear. Shadow's eyes opened, those amber pools meeting Mike's gaze one more time. The message was clear. They'd done it. They'd saved them. Job complete. At the hospital, Mike was treated for hypothermia and exhaustion. Shadow was rushed to the emergency veterinary clinic, where Sarah Chen was already waiting. Mike wanted to go with him, but the doctors refused to release him until his core temperature had returned to normal. It was 3 hours before Mike was finally cleared to leave. He drove directly to the veterinary clinic, still wearing the hospital scrubs they'd given him because his clothes had been too wet and frozen to salvage. Sarah met him in the waiting room, her expression carefully neutral. Shadow had survived the trek, but it had pushed his body beyond its limits. He had severe hypothermia, exhaustion, and his joints showed significant inflammation. Sarah had stabilized him, but the prognosis was clear. Shadow couldn't do this anymore. His body was breaking down. Another operation like today's would kill him. If Mike loved his partner, if he truly wanted what was best for Shadow, it was time to let him retire for real. Not the half-retirement of the last 6 months, where Shadow still trained and occasionally deployed, but full retirement. No more operations. No more rescues. Just rest and peace and the quiet life Shadow had earned 100 times over. Mike sat down heavily, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall. He asked if he could see Shadow. Sarah led him to the recovery area where Shadow was lying on a heated bed, IV in his leg, wrapped in blankets. The dog's eyes opened when Mike approached, and his tail gave a weak thump. Mike knelt beside the bed and buried his face in Shadow's fur, finally letting the tears come. He whispered apologies, thanked Shadow for everything, promised that the work was done now. They could both rest. Shadow's recovery took 2 weeks, longer than any injury he'd sustained in his entire career. Mike visited every day, watching as his partner slowly regained strength. The old dog's spirit was intact, but his body had finally said enough. Sarah Chen had been right about everything. Mike had pushed Shadow too hard, held on too long, let his own needs override what was best for his partner. It was a mistake Mike would have to live with, even though Shadow had survived. When Shadow was finally cleared to go home, Mike made changes. He converted part of his workshop into a comfortable space for Shadow, with heated floors and a raised bed that would be easier on the dog's joints. He adjusted his work schedule to spend more time at home. And he officially retired Shadow from the K9 program, though he kept the dog on the department roster as an honorary member. Shadow seemed content with the new arrangement. He still watched Mike's morning preparations with interest, still rode to the office sometimes, but there was no longer the intensity of needing to work. Shadow had given everything he had to give. Now he could simply be a dog. Mike found the transition harder than Shadow did. For months, Mike struggled with guilt over what he'd put Shadow through. Tom finally pulled him aside and told him to stop torturing himself. Shadow was a working dog, had been his entire life. Taking that away from him earlier wouldn't have been kindness, it would have been cruelty. Shadow had needed to work right up until his body couldn't do it anymore. Mike had honored that need, had given his partner purpose and dignity. The crash rescue had been Shadow's choice as much as Mike's. The dog could have refused to continue, could have stopped at any point. He hadn't, because saving people was what he did, what they both did. Tom's words helped, but Mike still caught himself watching Shadow with a mixture of love and sorrow. The dog who'd been his partner for over a decade, who'd saved countless lives, was now spending his days sleeping in patches of sunlight and going on gentle walks through the forest. It was the right ending, but it felt like a loss nonetheless. The department continued to thrive. The 2 new K9 teams that Shadow had helped train were performing excellently, handling everything from drug interdiction to search and rescue. Mike was proud of what they'd built, but he missed having Shadow by his side on operations. The election for permanent sheriff came in the spring. Mike had finally agreed to run, swayed by Tom's arguments and the support of the community. His opponent was a political insider from the county seat who promised to bring the department back to traditional values, which Mike recognized as code for the old days of minimal effort and maximum bureaucracy. The campaign was surprisingly vicious, with Mike's opponent attacking his unconventional methods, his unauthorized mountain rescue of Tom Bradley, even his close relationship with Shadow. The attacks backfired spectacularly. The community rallied around Mike, organizing grassroots support that overwhelmed his opponent's political machine. On election night, Mike won with 73% of the vote, the largest margin in the county's history. His acceptance speech was brief. He thanked the voters for their trust, promised to continue the work they'd started, and dedicated the victory to all the K9s who'd served the department, past and present. Shadow was at home that night, too old for the chaos of an election party, but Mike made sure to stop by and tell him the news. The dog's tail thumped against the floor, and Mike could swear Shadow understood. Summer came, and with it a surprise visit from Agent Cortez. She'd been promoted to head of the FBI's regional office and wanted Mike's input on a task force being formed to combat rural crime networks. Mike's work over the past year had attracted federal attention, and the Bureau wanted to replicate his model in other jurisdictions. They were also interested in his K9 program, which had become something of a template for how to effectively use working dogs in law enforcement. Mike agreed to consult with the task force, which led to him spending 2 days a month at the FBI office training agents and sharing lessons learned. It was rewarding work, knowing that the changes he'd made in his small county were influencing law enforcement practices across the region. Tom Bradley was thriving as chief deputy, and Mike increasingly trusted him to handle day-to-day operations. This gave Mike time to focus on the bigger picture work, the strategic planning and interagency cooperation that had never been his strong suit but that he'd learned to appreciate. One afternoon in late summer, Mike was in his office doing paperwork when Shadow, who'd been lying in his usual spot by the window, suddenly stood up. The dog moved to the door and whined, a sound Mike hadn't heard in months. Mike checked the security cameras and saw a woman approaching the building, walking strangely, almost staggering. He recognized the signs of someone in distress and went out to meet her. The woman collapsed as he reached her, and Mike caught her before she hit the pavement. She was covered in bruises, her clothes torn, her eyes wild with fear. Between gasping breaths, she told Mike her story. She'd been held captive for 2 months by a man who'd picked her up hitchhiking, kept in a cabin somewhere in the mountains. She'd finally managed to escape while he was passed out drunk, had run through the forest for hours until she'd reached the road, had hitchhiked and walked the final miles to town. Mike got her to the hospital, then assembled a tactical team. The woman had given them a location, approximate, but good enough to start with. And Mike knew that terrain, had mapped every cabin and structure in his county as part of his cold case work. There were only 3 possible locations that matched her description. They hit all 3 simultaneously. The second cabin was the right one. Inside, they found evidence of multiple victims, photographs and personal items suggesting that the woman who'd escaped wasn't his only captive. The man himself, Richard Hollis, was arrested without incident, too hungover to offer resistance. A search of his property uncovered remains of at least 4 victims buried in the surrounding forest, and evidence suggesting Hollis had been operating for over a decade. It was another major case that made national news, another demonstration of the transformed department's effectiveness. But for Mike, the most significant part of the case was Shadow. The old dog had sensed something wrong before Mike had seen it on the cameras. Even in retirement, even with his body worn out, Shadow's instincts remained sharp. He was still protecting, still serving, just in different ways. As autumn returned and the leaves began to change, Mike found himself reflecting on the year that had passed since he'd taken office. So much had changed, for himself, for Shadow, for the entire county. They'd built something good, something that would last. The department was strong, crime was down, cold cases were being solved, and the community trusted their law enforcement again. Mike had found purpose again, had remembered why he'd become a cop in the first place. But he'd also learned the cost of that purpose, the price both he and Shadow had paid. The injuries, the trauma, the pieces of themselves they'd given away and could never get back. Mike wondered sometimes if it had been worth it. Then he'd think about Emma Foster, safe with her family, about the Walsh family alive because Shadow had intervened, about the plane crash survivors who'd made it home. He'd think about the cold cases solved, giving families closure they'd thought would never come. He'd think about the trafficking victims rescued, given a chance at a new life. And he'd know the answer. It had been worth it. Every scar, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt and fear and pain. Because that was the job. To stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. To never give up, even when the case went cold or the odds were impossible. To trust your partner completely, whether that partner was human or K9 or both. Mike looked over at Shadow, who was sleeping peacefully in a patch of afternoon sunlight streaming through the office window. The old dog's muzzle was almost completely white now, his body relaxed in true rest for perhaps the first time in his life. He'd earned this peace. They both had. But Mike also knew that if the call came again, if someone needed help that only they could provide, Shadow would still answer. The dog might be retired, his body worn out, but his spirit was unbreakable. Just like Mike's, The years that followed brought a rhythm to Mike's life that he'd never expected to find. The sheriff's department continued to excel, his reforms becoming standard practice, his team growing stronger and more capable. Mike developed a reputation across the state as a sheriff who got results, who prioritized justice over politics, who built genuine relationships with the community he served. He was offered positions with larger departments, even a chance to run for state office, but he turned them all down. He'd found his place, and he wasn't leaving. Shadow's retirement was complete, but not inactive. The old German shepherd became something of a local celebrity, visiting schools for K9 demonstration days, attending community events, serving as the face of the department's outreach programs. Children who'd grown up hearing stories of Shadow's rescues would come to meet him, their eyes wide with awe at this living legend. Shadow tolerated the attention with patient dignity, seeming to understand his role had evolved from operator to ambassador. Mike watched these interactions with pride and a touch of sadness. This was Shadow's final act, his last service, and he was performing it perfectly. The two K9 teams Mike had trained were now senior dogs themselves, training the next generation. The program had expanded to 6 teams, making Mike's department one of the best-equipped rural law enforcement agencies in the state. Other sheriffs would visit to study their model, and Mike would credit Shadow every time, explaining that everything they'd built started with one exceptional dog and the bond between handler and K9. Tom Bradley had become more than just chief deputy. He was Mike's closest friend, the brother Mike had never had. They worked together seamlessly, covering each other's weaknesses, amplifying each other's strengths. Tom's leg had healed well enough that he was back to full duty, though he still walked with a slight limp on cold mornings. He wore it as a badge of honor, a reminder of what real law enforcement cost. 4 years into Mike's elected term as sheriff, on a cold November morning, Shadow didn't get up for breakfast. Mike found him lying peacefully in his bed, eyes closed, breathing shallow. He'd suffered a stroke during the night. Mike rushed him to the veterinary clinic, but Sarah Chen could only offer comfort, not hope. Shadow's body was finally giving out. His heart was failing. His organs were shutting down. He was in no pain, but there was nothing more they could do. Sarah gave Mike privacy, closing the door to the exam room and leaving him alone with his partner. Mike sat on the floor beside Shadow's bed and held the old dog's head in his lap. Shadow's eyes opened, those amber pools that had seen so much, done so much, saved so many. They were clear and aware, looking at Mike with what could only be described as love. Mike talked to Shadow for hours, reminiscing about their years together, the cases they'd solved, the lives they'd saved. He thanked Shadow for everything, for the partnership that had defined so much of his life, for the courage and loyalty that never wavered. He told Shadow it was okay to let go now, that he'd done enough, been enough, given enough. Shadow's tail moved slightly, one last thump against the bed. Then, with Mike holding him, Shadow took a final breath and was gone. Mike sat with him for a long time afterward, unable to let go, unwilling to accept that his partner of 12 years was really gone. When Sarah finally came back in, she found Mike still sitting there, tears streaming down his face, holding Shadow like he could will the life back into him. Sarah helped Mike carry Shadow's body to his truck. They wrapped him in his favorite blanket, the one he'd slept on for years. Mike drove home in silence, Shadow lying in the passenger seat one final time. Mike buried Shadow on his property, in a clearing overlooking the mountains they'd both loved. He dug the grave himself, refusing offers of help from Tom and others who wanted to pay their respects. This was something he needed to do alone. As he worked, Mike remembered every mission, every rescue, every moment of danger they'd faced together. He remembered Shadow as a young dog, full of energy and eager to work. He remembered Shadow in his prime, the best canine Mike had ever seen. And he remembered Shadow at the end, old and tired, but still willing to give everything. Mike marked the grave with a simple stone that read, Shadow. K9 Badge 47. He saved more than he knew. The department held a funeral with full honors. Shadow was the first K9 in the county's history to receive such recognition. Officers came from across the state, some bringing their own K9 partners to pay respects. The ceremony was brief but moving, recognizing a dog who'd epitomized everything law enforcement aspired to be. After the funeral, Mike took a week off, his first real vacation in 4 years. He spent it at his cabin, alone with his grief. Tom checked in daily, but respected Mike's need for solitude. The cabin felt empty without Shadow's presence, without the sound of the dog moving around, without the comfort of his companionship. Mike wrestled with questions that had no good answers. Had he done right by Shadow? Had he pushed him too hard, held on too long? Should he have retired him sooner, given him more years of peace? The guilt was crushing, made worse by the silence of the empty cabin. On the 7th day, Mike was sitting on his porch when a truck pulled up. It was Sarah Chen. She'd brought someone with her, a young German shepherd puppy, maybe 4 months old, with the same distinctive gray-white coat Shadow had. Sarah explained that she'd been breeding from Shadow's line for years, trying to preserve his exceptional traits. This puppy was Shadow's grandson, showing remarkable promise in early evaluations. Sarah wasn't suggesting Mike replace Shadow. That would be impossible. But she thought Mike might want to train this puppy, help shape him into the K9 he had the potential to become. Mike looked at the puppy, who was watching him with intelligent eyes that reminded him painfully of Shadow. For a moment, Mike wanted to refuse, to say he couldn't do this again, couldn't open himself up to another partnership that would inevitably end in heartbreak. Then the puppy walked over to him and sat down, leaning against Mike's leg in a gesture that was pure Shadow. Mike felt something crack open in his chest. Mike named the puppy Ghost, a tribute to the partner he'd lost and a hope for the future. Training Ghost became Mike's therapy, a way to work through his grief by channeling it into something productive. The young dog was exceptionally smart, learning commands faster than any K9 Mike had trained before. But he also had his own personality, more playful than Shadow had been, more independent. Mike learned to appreciate Ghost for who he was rather than comparing him to Shadow. Ghost wasn't a replacement. He was a continuation, carrying forward Shadow's legacy in his own unique way. The department's K9 program continued to grow under Mike's leadership. They were now training dogs for other departments across the state, sharing the expertise Mike and Shadow had developed over years of partnership. Ghost became part of this program, though Mike was careful not to push him into operational work too early. The young dog needed time to develop, to learn at his own pace. 6 months after Shadow's death, Mike received a letter from Emma Foster, the 12-year-old girl Shadow had helped rescue years ago. She was in high school now, and she wrote to tell Mike that she'd decided to go into law enforcement, inspired by the sheriff and his K9 who'd saved her life. She wanted to be a K9 handler someday, wanted to have the kind of partnership Mike and Shadow had. Mike read the letter 3 times, each time feeling a mixture of pride and sorrow. This was Shadow's legacy. Not just the lives he'd directly saved, but the inspiration he'd provided to others. Emma Foster wasn't the only one. Mike received letters and messages regularly from people who'd been touched by Shadow's story, who'd been inspired to enter law enforcement or work with service dogs or simply be better people. Shadow had changed lives in ways Mike was still discovering. Mike kept all these letters in a box in his office, a reminder that the pain of loss was the price of love, and love was what made everything else worthwhile. As spring returned, and the forest around Mike's cabin came back to life, he found himself healing. The sharp edge of grief had dulled into something he could carry. He still missed Shadow every day, still saw things that reminded him of his old partner, but the memories brought more smiles than tears now. Ghost was growing into an impressive young dog, showing flashes of the brilliance that had made Shadow legendary. But Mike was taking his time, not rushing the training, not pushing for operational deployment. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Tom Bradley stopped by one evening, bringing beer and the comfortable silence of old friendship. They sat on Mike's porch, watching Ghost play in the yard, and didn't need to say much. Tom understood what Mike was feeling, knew the weight of loss and the difficulty of moving forward. After a while, Tom mentioned that the state police were forming a special task force for major crimes in rural areas, and they wanted Mike to lead it. It would mean keeping his position as sheriff, but taking on additional responsibilities, coordinating multi-jurisdictional operations across a 3-county area. It was recognition of everything Mike had built, an acknowledgement that his model worked and should be expanded. Mike considered the offer carefully. A year ago, he would have said yes immediately, eager for the challenge, ready to prove himself on a larger stage. Now, sitting on his porch with his new partner playing in the yard, and the memory of his old partner present in everything around him, Mike wasn't sure. He'd achieved what he'd set out to do. The department was strong, the community was safe, justice was being served. Did he need to do more? Tom didn't push for an answer, just sat with him as darkness fell and the stars came out. It was Ghost who made the decision for Mike. The young dog came over and sat between them, looking up with eyes that held intelligence and promise. He was Shadow's grandson, carrying that genetic legacy forward. But he needed Mike to help him reach his potential, to guide him through training and into the work. Mike realized he wanted that. Wanted to see Ghost become the K9 he could be. Wanted to forge a new partnership while honoring the old one. Mike told Tom he'd accept the task force position, but with conditions. He'd need to maintain his current responsibilities as sheriff, and he'd need time to properly train Ghost before deploying him operationally. Tom smiled and said those conditions had already been negotiated. The state police weren't asking Mike to change what he was doing. They were asking him to teach others how to do it too. That night, after Tom left, Mike sat alone on his porch with Ghost at his feet. He looked up at the stars and thought about Shadow, about all they'd accomplished together, about the cost and the reward of a life dedicated to service. He thought about the Mackenzie family finally getting justice, about Emma Foster safe at home, about the plane crash survivors celebrating another year of life. He thought about all the cases still unsolved, all the people still waiting for someone to care enough to help them. The work was never finished. There would always be another case, another victim, another chance to make a difference. That was the burden and the blessing of law enforcement. You couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything, but you never stopped trying. Mike looked down at Ghost, who was watching him with attentive eyes, and felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders once again. This young dog was counting on him. The community was counting on him. And somewhere, Mike liked to think, Shadow was watching too, proud of what they'd built together, and confident Mike would carry it forward. Mike stood up, Ghost immediately rising beside him, already learning to mirror his movements. They went inside together, and Mike pulled out his training journals, the ones he'd kept throughout his years with Shadow. He'd start Ghost's training tomorrow, build on the foundation Sarah Chen had already established. It would take years to fully develop the young dog's potential, and there would be setbacks and frustrations along the way. But Mike had learned patience, had learned that the best partnerships couldn't be rushed. As he prepared for bed, Mike glanced at the photo on his nightstand. It showed him and Shadow on the day they'd graduated from K9 training, both of them young and ready to take on the world. Shadow's eyes in that photo held the same intensity Mike now saw in Ghost. The legacy continued. The work continued. And Mike Cross, retired cop turned sheriff, was exactly where he was supposed to be, with a partner by his side and a mission that mattered. That was enough. It had always been enough.